Imagine this. A small Kentucky town in the middle of the Civil War. 17 weddings. 16 funerals. All in just 8 months. Now here's the disturbing part. 15 of those funerals belonged to men who had all married the same woman. Her name was Constance Grimsley, and by the end of the war, she would be remembered as both the most devoted war widow in 3 counties, and possibly one of the deadliest women of the 19th century. But was she truly cursed by tragedy, or had she perfected a method of marrying soldiers, collecting their pensions, and sending them to early graves? This is not just a ghost story. It's a chilling true mystery from Civil War America, one that investigators tried to bury, and one that still leaves questions today. Millfield, Kentucky, a town caught in the war. To understand Constance, we have to step into Millfield, Kentucky in 1862. It was a small farming town, about 800 people, sitting just 15 miles from the Tennessee border. That made it dangerous territory, officially Union, but surrounded by Confederate sympathizers. Both armies needed Millfield. It wasn't the size of the town that mattered, but the supply routes that ran straight through it. The war transformed this quiet little community into something unrecognizable. The Methodist Church became a field hospital. Homes were filled with wounded soldiers. Horses clattered through the streets at all hours, and the sound of saws, amputations, echoed from makeshift operating tables. Into this chaos walked a woman who looked like she had stepped out of a painting. Enter Constance Grimsley. Constance Grimsley arrived in Millfield in the spring of 1862 with nothing but a carpet bag and a letter of introduction from a minister in Louisville. The letter described her as a Christian woman devoted to nursing wounded soldiers. She was 28 years old, tall, auburn hair that caught fire in the sunlight, the kind of beauty that townsfolk remembered decades later. The newspaper would later write that her face carried both beauty and Christian sympathy. Her story seemed heartbreaking enough to disarm even the most suspicious neighbor. She told people her father, a doctor, had died in a cholera outbreak. She had cared for her sick mother until her death. Now, alone in the world, she had come to Millfield to help nurse the boys dying so far from home. It was the perfect story. And people believed her. The angel of mercy, Dr. Patterson, the overworked town physician, practically begged for her help. Within weeks, she became known as the best nurse in the county. Soldiers who screamed under the doctor's rough hands went silent when she touched them. She had gentle hands, said Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, the boarding house owner where Constance stayed. The boys would sleep like babies under her care. But Constance hadn't come to Millfield with only compassion. Hidden in the false bottom of her carpet bag was a leather journal. Inside, written in tiny, cramped handwriting, were notes about plant extracts and their effects on the human body. Dosages, symptoms, timings. What looked like medical treatments was actually something darker. The kind of notes only a woman who had studied both healing and poisoning would keep. The perfect cover story. Constance wove her legend carefully. To Mrs. Hartwell, she confided that she had once been engaged to a Union officer. He had died at Bull Run. That loss, she claimed, had left her barren, unable to have children, but filled her heart with love for every wounded soldier she nursed. The story spread, and soon Constance wasn't just admired, she was trusted. Trusted enough to be alone with dying men. Trusted enough to become a wife. Husband number 1. On a warm June evening in 1862, Private Thomas Kellerman, a soldier of the 5th Kentucky Infantry, became the first of Constance's Millfield husbands. Thomas had taken shrapnel in his leg during a skirmish near Bowling Green. By the time he reached Millfield, the wound was festering. He couldn't walk without crutches. He faced possible amputation. When Constance offered to nurse him privately, everyone thought it was an act of mercy. Within 3 weeks, Thomas was proposing marriage. Witnesses remembered how Constance wept with joy, saying she could not bear to lose another love to this terrible war. They married immediately, in the converted Methodist Church, on June 18, 1862. Thomas leaned on crutches. Constance wore a simple blue dress she had sewn herself. Everyone called it the most romantic wartime wedding they had ever seen. .. 4 days of love. The honeymoon lasted exactly 4 days. On the morning of June 22, Mrs. Hartwell discovered Constance sobbing over her husband's lifeless body. Dr. Patterson wrote in his journal that Thomas had suffered from violent stomach cramps, sweats, and delirium before death. At one point, Thomas cried out warnings about bitter medicine and the woman with poison hands. The doctor dismissed it. He was overwhelmed with patience and trusted Constance. He ruled the death as gastric fever caused by his infected wound. The town pitied Constance. They marveled at her bad luck. They even praised her for her faith and devotion. But nobody noticed the small puncture marks on Thomas's arms, signs of injections. And nobody saw the tiny glass vial Constance slipped from under the mattress before the doctor signed the death certificate. A widow is born. The funeral broke hearts. Constance had to be physically held back from throwing herself into the grave. Women whispered that her grief was proof of her goodness. But Thomas Kellerman's death was only the beginning. Because within the next year, Millfield would see wedding after wedding, funeral after funeral, each one orbiting the same auburn-haired widow. The people of Millfield thought they were watching a tragic love story play out again and again. But in reality, they were watching the rise of the poison bride of Kentucky. Outro call to action. And that's only the beginning of Constance Grimsley's dark tale. In the next part, we'll uncover how this angel of mercy transformed Millfield into her personal hunting ground, and why both the Union and Confederate armies began investigating her strange trail of husbands. If you love chilling stories like this one, make sure to subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss part 2 of this series. And let me know in the comments, have you ever heard of other mysterious Civil War legends from your state? Fire. End of part 1, approximately 1,000 words. The Widow of Millfield, Part 2, The Angel Turns Dark. Hook. The people of Millfield believed they were watching a tragic love story play out again and again. But beneath the tears, the prayers, and the funeral processions, something far darker was unfolding. By the end of 1862, Constance Grimsley wasn't just the town's most devoted widow. She was becoming something else entirely, an angel of death, hiding in plain sight. A widow with a pension. When Private Thomas Kellerman died, Millfield wrapped Constance in sympathy. The church ladies brought her food. The town raised a small collection to help her grieve. Then word arrived. Thomas's military pension would be paid directly to his widow. The townsfolk rejoiced. Providence, they said, had provided for poor Constance in her time of need. Constance took a portion of that money and purchased a modest house on Elm Street. She told neighbors she needed privacy to mourn. But the truth was more practical. She needed her own space to work without interference. She called it a home of healing. Soldiers too weak for the hospital were carried to her door. She gave them warm meals, clean linens, and tender care. But that house soon became known for something else entirely. It became the place where soldiers went to die. The Elm Street House of Healing. The home was tidy, filled with flowers, and always smelled faintly of herbs. Constance told visitors she had invested her pension in medical supplies, herbs, tinctures, and special glass vessels. To the casual eye, it was the home of a dedicated nurse. But behind those locked doors, Constance's pattern grew. First came Corporal James Dunleavy of the 2nd Kentucky Cavalry. Then Sergeant William Brennan of the 9th Ohio Infantry. Then Private Henry Culpeper, a Confederate deserter. Each arrived wounded. Each was doted on by Constance. Each fell hopelessly devoted to their nurse. And each, within days of a quick wedding ceremony, was dead. The causes were always the same: complications from war wounds. To the people of Millfield, Constance was a saint. To the soldiers, she was the last face they saw before slipping into fevered agony. The town's angel of mercy. By winter of 1862, Constance had buried 4 husbands in Millfield. Yet her reputation only grew brighter. The newspaper praised her as our angel of mercy. Church women competed to bring her casseroles. Grieving families thanked her for easing their sons' last days. Even soldiers who recovered under her care spoke of her kindness, Though notably, these were men never sick enough to marry her. Dr. Patterson, the town's physician, had begun to notice the strange pattern. But he silenced his doubts. After all, the men Constance married were the sickest patients, the ones he had little hope of saving. If they died under her care, surely it was no fault of hers. Or so he told himself. A whispered confession. The first crack in Constance's angelic mask came not from the doctor, but from a man of faith. Chaplain Samuel Rutherford, just 26 years old, served the Union soldiers in the region. A graduate of Princeton Seminary, he was intelligent, devout, and unafraid of uncomfortable truths. Rutherford first became uneasy while delivering last rites for Sergeant William Brennan. In his fevered state, Brennan whispered something strange about the medicine and being hurried to heaven. The chaplain dismissed it as delirium, until 2 months later, when Henry Culpeper, a dying Confederate deserter, said nearly the same thing. By now, Rutherford was troubled. He began keeping notes, an unofficial record of deaths in Millfield. He listed their injuries, their symptoms, and the circumstances of their deaths. What he discovered horrified him. The pattern no one wanted to see. The soldiers who died under Constance's care weren't always the worst cases. In fact, some had been expected to recover. Their wounds were serious, yes, but not fatal. Yet within days of marrying Constance, every one of them displayed the same set of symptoms. Sudden gastric pain, violent sweating, delirium and hallucinations. Symptoms that didn't match their wounds at all. On New Year's Eve, 1862, the chaplain was called to the bedside of Private Daniel Hawthorne, Constance's fourth husband. He had taken a bullet through the shoulder, a painful but survivable wound. As Rutherford bent close to pray, Hawthorne gripped his wrist with surprising strength. His words burned into the chaplain's mind forever. "She's killing us, Padre. The medicine, it burns like hellfire. She's killing us for the money. And she won't stop until someone stops her." Minutes later, Hawthorne was dead. Official cause: complications of his battlefield wound. But Rutherford knew better. The chaplain investigates. The young minister faced a terrible choice. Accusing Constance without evidence would destroy his reputation, and possibly his life. But ignoring the pattern meant more men would die. So he began quietly investigating. First, he compared Millfield's deaths to reports from other towns. What he found was chilling. In at least 3 other Kentucky towns, widows had appeared with letters of introduction, married wounded soldiers, and inherited pensions after their deaths. In every case, the women claimed to have medical training. In every case, soldiers died with fever, gastric pain, and delirium. Could there be others like Constance? Tracing the poison, Rutherford began interviewing apothecaries across the region. Slowly, the truth took shape. A druggist in Lebanon reported selling white arsenic to a woman matching Constance's description. She claimed it was for rat infestations. A pharmacist in Springfield had sold her large amounts of antimony, a medicine in small doses but deadly when misused. An old herb woman, Granny Fletcher, told the chaplain that Constance had once visited her, asking about plants that could ease soldiers into peace. Fletcher had refused, suspicious of her intent. Every lead painted the same picture. Constance wasn't unlucky. She wasn't cursed. She was deliberate, calculating, deadly. The next target. While Rutherford gathered evidence, Constance was preparing for another wedding. Her new target: Lieutenant Marcus Sheffield, a Union cavalry officer. Sheffield's wound was not life-threatening. A bullet had grazed his thigh. Under Patterson's care, he was expected to recover fully. But Constance insisted he needed special care. "He suffers terrible nightmares," she told the doctor. "He wakes up screaming every night. What he needs is a woman's touch, someone to nurse both his body and his spirit." Dr. Patterson, exhausted and grateful for her help, agreed. Sheffield was moved to the Elm Street house. The trap was set. Cliffhanger ending outro. As 1863 dawned, Constance Grimsley's house on Elm Street was filled once more with the smell of herbs and the sound of her gentle voice. The townsfolk saw only a widow's compassion. But Chaplain Rutherford saw a killer perfecting her craft. And as Sheffield's health began to falter under Constance's care, Rutherford knew he had to act, before Millfield's Angel of Mercy claimed her next victim. Stay tuned for Part 3, where we follow the chaplain deeper into his dangerous investigation, and uncover the shocking lengths Constance would go to keep her secrets buried. Fire. End of Part 2. Approximately 1,000 words. Would you like me to also sketch a 10-part master outline of this series so each episode builds suspense and ends on a powerful cliffhanger? That way we'll know exactly where to aim as the horror deepens toward Part 10. Part 3. The Angel of Mercy Unmasked. The winter sun rose weakly over Millfield on the morning of February 13, 1863, throwing pale light across the frozen streets. The town should have been buzzing with joy, for Valentine's Day promised a rare occasion of celebration, a wedding between the dashing Lieutenant Sheffield and the beloved Angel of Mercy, Constance Grimsley. But beneath the surface, a darker current stirred. Chaplain Samuel Rutherford had finally convinced Colonel Matthew Harrison that Constance's compassion was nothing but a mask, concealing a string of deliberate, calculated murders. At dawn, a small detachment slipped quietly into Constance's modest home on Elm Street. The air was heavy with the smell of lavender, the kind of scent that masked sickness in the sickroom. The front parlor appeared ordinary enough: family portraits, Bibles worn soft from use, letters of thanks from soldiers who believed she had saved their lives. Yet behind that veneer of piety, the investigators uncovered a nightmare that would shatter the town's faith in its angel. Hidden behind a loose board in her private study, they found the journal. The handwriting was neat, meticulous, even elegant. But the words that filled its pages froze dry. Patterson's blood. These were not notes of care or prayers for the wounded. They were experiments. Precise records of doses, symptoms, and death. Each victim catalogued not as a soul in pain, but as a subject in an unholy study. Subject responds well to initial treatment of antimony sulfide, one entry read. Gastric distress within 6 hours. Increased dosage tomorrow. Another, more chilling still. Arsenic oxide proves more reliable for final treatment. Death within 48 hours. Symptoms indistinguishable from battlefield fever. No suspicion from physician. Doctor. Patterson's face went white as he realized his own medical notes had been copied and woven into her accounts, providing cover for her crimes. She had used his authority to shield herself, transforming his care into camouflage for murder. Sergeant Major O'Brien's search yielded more horrors. In the kitchen, vials labeled innocuously as headache powder and stomach soother, but containing deadly concentrations of arsenic and mercury. In the dresser, men's wedding rings, pocket watches, and forged pension documents, proof she had planned to profit long after the graves were filled. But the most damning discovery came from beneath her bed: letters from other women, conspirators scattered across the South. The words of one, Margaret, from Tennessee chilled the room. The antimony works perfectly when mixed with medicine. Soldiers beg for their final doses, believing it eases their pain. They expire within 3 days of the wedding. Enough time to claim the marriage. No suspicion. And another from Elizabeth, in Virginia. Widows are beyond reproach. Use that. Mothers and sisters make no competing claims. The army recognizes the widow first. The scope was staggering. This was no isolated killer. It was a network, a web of black widows preying upon the chaos of war. Colonel Harrison slammed the journal shut. His jaw was tight, his eyes burning with the weight of command. We arrest her tomorrow morning before the wedding. Quietly. Sheffield must be kept alive. But fate had other plans. As they prepared to leave, a shadow crossed the frosted window. Constance herself stood at the corner of Elm Street, speaking to Mrs. Hartwell. Her eyes, dark, calculating, fell upon her own home. Even from a distance, they could see her face harden as she realized what had transpired. She knows, Harrison muttered. Without a word, Constance turned sharply and walked toward the church. But instead of entering, she passed it, slipping into the woods beyond the cemetery, a small satchel clutched tightly in her hand. After her, barked Harrison. She cannot reach Sheffield. The pursuit began through the snow-laden trees. Sergeant Major O'Brien flanked from the right, while Harrison, Rutherford, and Patterson pressed forward along the main path. The woods groaned under the weight of winter, branches snapping as boots crunched across ice. Yet Constance was clever. Her footprints led one way, then circled back, looping around like a fox escaping hounds. But Constance was not fleeing. She was hunting. By the time Harrison realized this, it was too late. She had doubled back through the trees, slipping unseen toward the church where Sheffield waited. Weak from his wounds, his mind clouded by both love and lingering fever, he sat in the front pew, rehearsing vows that would never be spoken. The church was empty except for him. The stained glass windows glowed faintly with winter light. He heard the door creak open, turned with a smile, and saw his bride-to-be stepping gracefully inside, her black mourning gown swaying like a shadow. "My love," she whispered, her voice a balm, her smile radiant as ever. "You look so pale. Let me give you something to strengthen you." From her satchel, she drew a small vial. Sheffield, trusting, reached for it without hesitation. Outside, Rutherford and Harrison burst from the trees. They spotted smoke curling faintly from the church chimney and sprinted forward, boots sliding on frozen mud. The heavy doors groaned open under Harrison's hand. What they saw inside would haunt them forever. Constance stood over Sheffield, vial in hand, her fingers curled like claws around the glass. Sheffield's lips were already wet with the poison she had coaxed him to drink. His eyes fluttered as convulsions began to rack his body. "Stop her!" Rutherford roared. Constance turned, her face pale but her eyes burning with feral determination. With a speed born of desperation, she hurled the vial at the floor. Glass shattered, the acrid stench of arsenic filling the air. Then she fled, darting past the pews and through a side door before the soldiers could seize her. Harrison rushed to Sheffield's side, shouting for Patterson. The doctor knelt, frantic, forcing a stomach pump into action, trying to save the young lieutenant from becoming her final groom. Outside, Constance disappeared once more into the Kentucky wilderness, her dark veil streaming behind her like a banner of death. The hunt was far from over. Millfield, once a quiet town of farms and hymns, was now the stage of a manhunt that stretched beyond its borders. Constance Grimsley, the angel of mercy, had been unmasked. But with allies in other states, with knowledge of poisons and disguises, she was more dangerous than ever. The people of Millfield whispered of her long after that night, that they could hear her steps in the graveyard, that the February wind carried her laughter, that she was not a woman at all, but something darker sent to prey upon the broken and the wounded. The war would rage on, but so too would the legend of Constance Grimsley, the widow who turned mercy into murder. Coffin. If this chilling tale leaves you unsettled, share it with someone who dares to tread into the shadows of history. Subscribe for the next part of this horror saga, where the hunt intensifies and the line between superstition and reality blurs even further. Would you like me to make part 4 even darker, shifting from the military investigation into almost gothic horror territory, night hunts, graveyard settings, supernatural rumors, or keep it firmly grounded in historical crime realism with Constance as a cunning fugitive? Part 4: The Wedding That Never Was. The bells of Millfield's small wooden church tolled noon on February 13, 1863, though their sound carried not the warmth of celebration but the foreboding echo of doom. Snow drifted silently across the Kentucky hills, softening the streets, muffling footsteps, and cloaking the town in a deceptive peace. Inside the church, Lieutenant Sheffield sat nervously in the front pew, hands trembling as he rehearsed his vows under his breath. His uniform hung loosely from his shoulders, his body still weakened by fever and wounds, but his eyes glowed with the desperate hope of a man who believed love had rescued him from death. Unbeknownst to him, the woman he was preparing to wed, Constance Grimsley, was already moving with a predator's intent. While Colonel Harrison and his men combed the cemetery and surrounding woods, Constance slipped through the church's side. In trance, her black cloak dusted with snow and her gloved hand clutching a small satchel. Hidden within it were 2 glass vials, one of arsenic and the other of laudanum mixed with antimony. If she could not marry Sheffield under the guise of mercy, she would claim him in death and vanish into the wilderness before the noose of justice tightened around her neck. Sheffield looked up as Constance entered, smiling faintly. "My angel," he whispered, his voice hoarse, "You nearly had me thinking you'd forgotten me." Constance's smile was radiant, almost too radiant. "I could never forget you, William," she said softly, setting the satchel discreetly beneath the pew. "I only wish to ease your pain before tomorrow's ceremony. One last draft of my medicine, and you'll have strength enough to stand proudly as my husband." But before she could reach him, the church doors burst open with a violent crash. Colonel Harrison, Chaplain Rutherford, and Dr. Patterson stormed in, their boots scattering snow across the wooden floor. Behind them followed Sergeant Major O'Brien with his revolver drawn. "Constance Grimsley," the colonel declared, his voice echoing like a cannon shot, "you are under arrest for the murder of Union soldiers and civilians under the guise of mercy." The calm mask on Constance's face shattered for the first time. Her lips tightened, and her eyes narrowed with serpentine malice. Still, she moved with unsettling composure, kneeling beside Sheffield and taking his hand in her own. "Do you hear them, William?" she said, her voice sweet as poisoned honey. "They wish to separate us. They envy what we have. Do not listen to them." Sheffield, pale and confused, looked from his beloved to the stern faces of his superiors. His breath quickened. "What is this?" he asked weakly. She saved me. She nursed me back from death." Rutherford stepped forward, his hand clutching the small journal they had seized from her home. "No, Lieutenant. She has been poisoning you slowly. Every fever, every spasm, it was her doing. You are not her first victim, only her next." Sheffield's eyes darted to Constance, who stroked his hand tenderly, as though nothing in the world were amiss. "Lies," she whispered. "They fear a woman's devotion. Trust me, William. Trust your angel." Before anyone could move, her free hand slipped into the satchel. In one swift motion, she uncorked the vial of arsenic and tried to press it to Sheffield's lips. "Drop it," bellowed Harrison. The sergeant major lunged forward, grappling with Constance. The vial shattered across the pew, spilling its milky contents onto the wood. Sheffield cried out in shock, stumbling backward as the liquid hissed into the cracks of the floorboards. Constance shrieked with a fury that seemed inhuman. Her cloak tore as O'Brien restrained her, and for the first time the congregation saw her as she truly was, not the angel of mercy, but a banshee in black, hair wild, face contorted, eyes blazing with hatred. "You fools," she spat, struggling violently. "Do you think you can stop us? I am but one among many. Others will carry on where I leave off. The war is our harvest, and you cannot watch every widow, every nurse, every angel who bends over the dying." Her words chilled the air more than the February winds outside. Patterson's face turned gray at the confirmation of the conspiracy hinted at in her letters. Rutherford murmured a prayer under his breath, crossing himself as though warding off a demon. Sheffield, trembling, clutched his chest. "Is it true?" he asked hoarsely. "Constance, my love, did you?" Her eyes softened for just a flicker, and she whispered, "I gave them peace. And I would have given you the same, William." A beautiful end. Together. That final confession shattered what remained of Sheffield's devotion. His hand fell limp from hers, and his body shook with horror. "Take her," Colonel Harrison ordered grimly. The soldiers dragged her struggling down the aisle, her screams reverberating through the church rafters. "You'll hang me, but you'll never stop the others," she wailed. "We are everywhere, mercy in black veils. You'll never know which hands bring healing and which bring death." They forced her out into the snow, shackled and raging, while the townsfolk gathered in silence, their faces pale as parchment. The angel of mercy, their saint, was nothing more than a butcher cloaked in devotion. Inside, Sheffield collapsed onto the pew, covering his face with his hands. His heart, once aflame with love, was now smothered in ash. Rutherford placed a hand on his shoulder, whispering words of comfort. But Sheffield would never be the same. He had loved a monster, and that knowledge would gnaw at him until the end of his days. That night, Millfield did not sleep. Torches burned outside the jailhouse where Constance was held. Men muttered of lynching, women clutched their children close, and the snow fell endlessly, as though the heavens themselves sought to bury the horror that had taken root in their town. In her cell, Constance sat quietly, her fury replaced with cold calculation. She hummed a hymn under her breath, her eyes glimmering with a terrible serenity. For though the bars held her body, her words had already escaped into the world. And somewhere, in Tennessee, Virginia, and perhaps beyond, other angels read her letters by candlelight and prepared their own mixtures of poison, ready to step into the role she could no longer play. Millfield had captured its demon, but the war still raged, and in its shadows, Mercy remained a mask for murder. Coffin to be continued. Would you like me to make Part 5 the trial and execution of Constance grim, historic, psychological horror, or would you prefer it to expand on the wider conspiracy network of murderous angels she mentioned? Part 5 The Trial of the Angel. The courthouse in Millfield had never hosted a trial so grave, nor drawn such crowds. Farmers left their plows in frozen fields, soldiers rode in from distant posts, and widows in black veils filled the gallery until no seat remained. Word had spread across Kentucky that the infamous Angel of Mercy was to face judgment, not for healing, but for the silent slaughter of men who had trusted her hand. It was March of 1863, and the air still bore winter's bite. The courthouse smelled of damp wool, wood smoke, and fear. Sheriff Hardin escorted Constance Grimsley into the chamber, her wrists bound in iron shackles, though she held herself with the poise of a queen. Her black gown had been exchanged for a coarse gray prison dress, yet even in rags she carried an unsettling dignity, her chin high, her gaze sweeping across the spectators as though she were the one judging them. Lieutenant Sheffield sat near the front, pale and gaunt. Though doctors swore the poison had been purged from his system, the weakness lingered. He had once dreamed of calling her his bride, now he was forced to watch her as his would-be executioner. His hands trembled on his cane as he stared at her, torn between grief and rage. The presiding judge, Elias Thorncroft, entered with a heavy gavel in hand. He was an old man with sunken cheeks, a veteran of the Revolutionary War, and his presence commanded silence. Constance Grimsley, he began, his voice like gravel sliding down stone, you stand accused of treason, murder, and conspiracy against the United States. How do you plead? Constance smiled faintly, as though the words were a jest. Mercy, she replied softly. I plead mercy. A shudder rippled through the crowd. The prosecution wasted no time. Colonel Harrison presented the journal found in her home, its pages scrawled with recipes of poison, dates, and names of men who had died under her care. Dr. Patterson testified to the chemical traces found in Sheffield's blood. Chaplain Rutherford read aloud passages of her letters, revealing a secret network of women who wore the mask of healers while carrying out silent executions. Each testimony tightened the noose around her neck. Yet Constance never faltered. She sat with folded hands, her face serene, her dark eyes fixed upon the jury as if daring them to look away. When at last it was her turn to speak, she rose gracefully. The room held its breath. You call me a murderer, she began, her voice low but steady, yet you cheer the men who slaughter by cannon and musket. You call me treasonous, but I was loyal to suffering itself. I did not kill for hatred, nor for nation, but for peace. I ended the groans, the fevered cries, the endless begging for water and morphine. I gave them silence. Tell me, Judge Thorncroft, is that not mercy? Her words rang through the chamber like a hymn. Some women in the gallery wept openly, others turned their faces away in horror. Even the jurors shifted uneasily, caught between revulsion and a strange, reluctant awe. But the illusion cracked when Colonel Harrison thundered back, mercy is comfort without malice. You did not ease suffering, you created it. You poisoned men who might have lived, who might have seen their homes again. Your mercy was a mask for bloodlust. For the first time, a flicker of anger twisted Constance's face. And what of you, Colonel? She hissed. How many men have you ordered into open fire, knowing they would be torn apart? Are you not a butcher? At least my hand was gentle. Gasps erupted through the crowd. Judge Thorncroft slammed his gavel for order. Enough, he barked. The trial dragged on for 3 days, each one colder than the last. Sheffield was called to testify. His voice shook as he told the court how Constance had whispered comfort into his fevered ears even as she slipped poison into his broth. I loved her, he confessed, tears spilling down his cheeks. I would have died for her. And she would have let me die, for herself. Constance did not flinch. She merely watched him with eyes that seemed to mourn his weakness rather than her betrayal. At last, the jury delivered their verdict, guilty on all counts. The sentence was death by hanging. The gallery erupted in murmurs, some of relief, others of sorrow. Outside, a mob clamored for immediate justice, torches flaring against the night. Yet within the courtroom, Constance remained composed. She inclined her head as though accepting a crown. "Death does not frighten me," she said softly, her voice carrying in the hush. "For in death, I shall join those I tended. And you who condemn me, you will hear my hymn in your sleep. You will see my face each time you close your eyes." Her words were prophetic, for in the weeks that followed, Millfield was not free of her presence. The jailer swore that each night she sang in her cell, a soft, lilting hymn that drifted through the stone walls like a ghost's lullaby. Farmers claimed their livestock grew restless when her voice rose. Mothers said their children woke screaming at the sound of a woman's song, though no music could be heard by mortal ears. On April 6, 1863, she was led to the gallows. The square was packed with soldiers and townsfolk, the air thick with the metallic tang of fear. Sheffield stood at the edge of the crowd, his face ashen. Constance walked with unearthly calm, her bare feet leaving prints in the dust. As the noose was placed around her neck, she lifted her face to the sky and began to sing, not a hymn of surrender, but a chilling lullaby that stilled even the crows circling overhead. Her voice cut through the silence like a blade. Men gripped their rifles tighter. Women clutched their children close. Even the executioner hesitated. When the trapdoor fell, her body jerked, but her song seemed to linger in the air, a haunting thread that refused to break. And in that lingering sound, Millfield realized a terrible truth. Though the angel of mercy was dead, her shadow remained. For whispers of her letters had spread beyond Kentucky, carried by unseen hands, read by women who longed for power cloaked in piety. Constance Grimsley was gone, but her hymn had already been sown. And the harvest of death had only just begun. Coffin to be continued. Would you like me to make part 6 about the legacy of Constance's letters, how other angels rose across the war, spreading the terror into legend, ending with a chilling twist? Part 6: The Hymn in the Ashes. Spring gave way to summer, yet in Millfield the memory of Constance Grimsley's hanging did not fade. The gallows still stood in the square, its wood darkened with rain, its rope left to swing like a warning. Yet the people whispered that on certain nights, when the moon hung low and pale, the rope swayed though the wind was still, and a faint woman's song drifted across the fields. The hymn, her hymn, men swore they heard it while guarding the courthouse. Children spoke of a lady in gray, who walked the edge of the cemetery, her feet bare, her lips moving though no sound escaped. Wives found their husbands murmuring Constance's lullaby in their sleep, voices cracking as though echoing hers. Sheriff Hardin dismissed the stories as fear. "The dead don't walk," he growled. Yet he himself had taken to sleeping with a pistol beneath his pillow. But the whispers grew louder when, weeks after her death, a package arrived in town, addressed to no one, carried by a rider who claimed he'd been paid in gold to deliver it. Inside were letters, bound with a strip of black ribbon. The handwriting was unmistakable, Constance's. The town was seized with dread. How could she write from the grave? Colonel Harrison opened the bundle and read aloud in the courthouse. "Greater than, Sisters of Mercy, do not despair at my passing. The hymn cannot be silenced. Each hand that has touched this letter is already bound to me, each eye that reads these words is part of my song. Continue the work. Do not fear the gallows, for death is but another veil. I am with you still." The crowd gasped. Some women fainted. The colonel tried to burn the letters in the stove, but the paper resisted flame, curling only at the edges, the words glowing faintly as if written in ink that did not wish to die. The stories spread. Farmers whispered that Constance had written hundreds of such letters before her capture, sending them to towns across Kentucky, Tennessee, even Virginia. In each place, women of piety and shadow received her hymn, and strange deaths followed. The Plague of the Sisters. By midsummer, rumors of the Mercy Circle reached Millfield. In Louisville, 2 surgeons were found dead, their tongues blackened as if from poison. In Nashville, an entire infirmary was emptied in a single night, patients slipping into quiet death, the nurses vanishing before dawn. Soldiers whispered that there were dozens of women, dressed as angels of compassion, who carried bowls of broth and cups of tea laced with unseen fire. They would pray with the men, sing hymns at their bedside, and then close their eyes forever. The army began to fear its own nurses. Trust turned to suspicion. Some men refused food unless it came from a soldier's hand. Chaplains warned against the hymn of false mercy. But the more the warnings spread, the more the fear deepened, and the more powerful the legend of Constance became. She had become more than a woman. She was an idea, a specter that slipped between the cracks of war. The return of the lieutenant. Lieutenant Sheffield, still weakened from Constance's poison, lived in bitter solitude. He had once believed in her goodness, her tenderness, her promise of healing. Now he carried her betrayal like a wound deeper than any musket ball. One night, restless and feverish, he dreamed of her. She stood in his chamber, barefoot, her gray dress swaying like smoke. She leaned close, her lips brushing his ear. Greater than, you lived, Henry. But you will never be free of me. Each breath you take is mine. He woke with a cry, his room filled with the faint scent of lavender and bitter herbs, the scent of her apothecary. The next day, Sheffield went to the courthouse to demand the letters be destroyed once and for all. Colonel Harrison agreed, and together they rode out to burn them at the old battlefield, where smoke would carry the ashes far from Millfield. But as the flames consumed the parchment, Sheffield swore he heard voices in the fire, women singing, their tones weaving into the same hymn that had haunted him since her hanging. The letters shriveled, yet their song lingered, carried on the wind. Harrison tried to steady him. They're gone, he said firmly. Words cannot rise from ash. But Sheffield knew otherwise, for in that moment, he saw her shadow cast long upon the smoke. The Ashen Hymn. By autumn, strange phenomena plagued Millfield. Livestock were found dead in their pens, their bodies untouched but their eyes wide open, fixed on some unseen figure. Children began to draw pictures of a woman with long hair and empty eyes, standing at the gallows. Hymns were heard at night not just in the fields, but in the very walls of houses, like whispers slipping through cracks in the timber. Dr. Patterson, once the town's man of science, confessed that he too had received one of Constance's letters before the trial. He had burned it, but in his dreams it returned, written across the inside of his eyelids. Her hymn is not bound to ink, he muttered. It is bound to the soul. Millfield grew paranoid. Women who served as healers were shunned. Men looked with suspicion at their own wives. A few were accused of being sisters of mercy, and driven from town. Yet with every exile, with every hanging, the hymn only spread further. A terrible legacy. The war raged on, and bodies piled higher than faith could sustain. Soldiers began to whisper that perhaps Constance had been right, that death was kinder than the battlefield. Some even prayed for her sisters to find them, to bring them mercy, before the cannons did. By the winter of 1863, the Union Army issued orders forbidding women from administering medicine unless directly supervised by a surgeon. But it was too late. The hymn had taken root, and wherever men lay groaning, the fear of the angel of mercy walked among them. And though Constance's body lay buried in Millfield soil, her legend became immortal. Some nights, Sheffield sat by his window, staring at the gallows that no longer held a rope. He wondered if he had truly survived her, or if, as she had whispered, every breath he took belonged to her. For still, when the wind was coldest, he heard her song, clear as the day she died. And each time, his heart betrayed him. It longed for her voice, even as it cursed her name. Coffin to be continued in Part 7. Would you like me to make Part 7 the point where the legend of Constance reaches other states, turning into a cult-like movement of women healers, and introduce a darker supernatural element, where her ghost begins to appear alongside her followers? Part 7 The Mercy Cult. The winter of 1863 was harsh, but colder still were the whispers that traveled down the roads, through taverns, and across the flickering lamplight of army camps. Wherever soldiers gathered, talk of Constance Grimsley returned like a haunting refrain. She was dead, yes, hanged before the eyes of Millfield, but her voice lived on. Men swore they heard her hymn in their dreams. Women carried letters said to bear her words, ink glowing faintly in the dark. And then came the stories of a new terror, the mercy cult. The spread of the sisters. In Tennessee, a surgeon vanished. His journal, found weeks later in the mud near a burned field hospital, recorded his last suspicions. Greater than, they are not nurses, they are acolytes. They gather by night, whispering her hymn. They wear white veils over their faces, and when they remove them, their lips are stained black. They speak her name as though she were risen from the grave. God help us. In Virginia, 2 Confederate officers were discovered dead in their quarters. Their bodies bore no wounds, but across the wall in soot was written, "Mercy is eternal." The Sisters of Mercy had ceased being mere rumor. They were everywhere, appearing in towns with food and medicine, then vanishing after funerals multiplied. Sheffield's curse. Lieutenant Henry Sheffield could not escape her. Each night he dreamed of Constance, her gray dress swirling like smoke, her hymn coiling through the marrow of his bones. He would wake in sweat, clutching his pistol, only to find the air heavy with the scent of lavender and wormwood, the very fragrance of her hands when she'd given him tea. He tried to resist, tried to bury himself in duties, but wherever he rode with his regiment, reports of the sisters followed. Once, on a muddy road outside Bowling Green, he came upon 3 wagons overturned. The wounded within had all perished, faces peaceful, lips curved in faint smiles. Beside them was a discarded hymnal, its pages marked with soot. Sheffield snatched it up, trembling. The words written inside matched the lullaby Constance had sung to him. Only this time, the ink shimmered as though wet, though the rain had long since ceased. He threw it into the fire that night. The flames flared green, and the song rose from the crackling wood as though mocking him. Greater than, every breath you take is mine. Sheffield began to wonder if her execution had not killed her at all, but rather loosed her spirit into the world. Colonel Harrison's mission. Meanwhile, Colonel Harrison had grown grim and weary. Reports of poisoned infirmaries spread to his desk daily, each bearing the same strange detail, the sound of women singing just before the men slipped away. "This is no mere hysteria," he muttered in a council meeting. "This is organized. Someone, something, is leading them." The council laughed at first. But when an entire Union regiment at Murfreesboro was found dead in its tents without a single shot fired, the laughter died. Harrison vowed to crush the mercy cult. He ordered Sheffield to ride with him into Tennessee to investigate. Together they tracked rumors from town to town, following the trail of strange healers who left death in their wake. Each place bore signs not unlike witchcraft. Circles of ash in fields, bones arranged in patterns, hymns etched into wood with no hand to carve them. The gathering at Shiloh. In late March, word reached them of a secret gathering near the Shiloh battlefield. Locals spoke of women in gray veils walking by lantern light, humming as they carried baskets into the woods. Sheffield and Harrison rode out with a small company of men. The night was thick, the trees heavy with fog. At the edge of the old battlefield, they heard it, soft at first, then rising, the hymn. A circle of women stood among the gravestones. Each wore a white veil, each swayed in rhythm as they sang. At their center burned a great fire, and above it, nailed to a wooden frame, was a soldier's uniform, stained with blood, the name, Sheffield, still visible on its torn lining. Sheffield's breath caught. It was his old coat, lost when he had collapsed under her poison tea. One of the women stepped forward. She lifted her veil. It was not Constance, but her eyes glowed as though lit from within, and when she spoke, it was Constance's voice that came. "Greater than, you lived, Henry. But you belong to me still." The fire flared. The hymn swelled. The soldiers with Harrison staggered, clutching their heads as though drunk with sleep. One by one, they dropped to their knees. Harrison shouted, firing his pistol into the air, but the bullet seemed to vanish in smoke. Sheffield, trembling, reached for his weapon, but his hand froze, paralyzed by something deeper than fear. The woman's gaze pierced him, and in her face he saw Constance, alive again, her smile both tender and cruel. The escape. With desperate strength, Harrison seized Sheffield by the collar and dragged him backward into the trees. Shots rang out behind them, but none struck. The hymn followed, rising like thunder, echoing through the battlefield where thousands had already died years before. The men stumbled until dawn. When at last they stopped, Harrison's face was pale. "Sheffield," he said, voice low, "we are not chasing ghosts of rumor. We are at war with something older, darker. She is not gone. She has disciples, and through them, she breathes." Sheffield could only nod. His heart still pounded with the rhythm of her song. A curse unbroken. News spread swiftly after Shiloh. Entire camps were abandoned when the sisters were rumored nearby. Soldiers claimed to see Constance walking in the smoke after cannon fire, her hair unbound, her hymn rising above the screams of the wounded. The legend grew monstrous. Some said she was death itself, wandering the fields in grey robes, choosing who would be spared and who would be taken. But Sheffield knew the truth was worse. She was not death. She was mercy, and mercy, in her hands, was a more terrible weapon than any musket or blade. Coffin to be continued in Part 8. Would you like Part 8 to show the mercy cult becoming almost religious in scale, with Constance's ghost beginning to manifest fully before her followers, binding them together like a church of the dead? Part 8: The Church of the Fallen. By the spring of 1864, the mercy cult was no longer a whisper. It was a flood. From the ashes of burned towns and the blood-soaked soil of battlefields, they rose. Veiled women, singing in mournful harmony, offering mercy to the weary and the dying. Where they walked, men laid down their rifles and closed their eyes, never waking again. Where they prayed, entire infirmaries emptied overnight. And now, their reach had stretched beyond Tennessee and Kentucky. Reports came from Georgia, from Pennsylvania, even from the outskirts of Washington itself. Constance Grimsley, dead, buried, condemned, had become something greater, a saint of the damned. Her followers called themselves not just sisters anymore. They called themselves the Church of the Fallen. The hymn in the Capitol. In July, a senator from Ohio rose to speak against war appropriations. His words were strong, but midway his tongue faltered. Witnesses swore they heard a faint tune drifting through the chamber, though no instrument played. The senator's eyes rolled back, and he collapsed, dead before he hit the floor. Scrawled across his papers was a single line, written in ash. "Every soul deserves mercy." Fear spread through the government like plague. Was the war cursed? Was God punishing the nation? Or had some darker power risen from the very soil? Harrison's pursuit. Colonel Harrison refused to let terror claim victory. He gathered a band of men, skeptics, priests, scholars, soldiers too hardened to be swayed by song. Among them rode Lieutenant Sheffield, his face gaunt, his eyes haunted by visions of Constance in every shadow. "We will tear the church out by its roots," Harrison swore, slamming his fist onto a campaign table. "She was a woman, no more. And these women are not angels, they are killers. We will burn them out." But Sheffield said nothing. Deep inside, he feared Harrison was wrong. He feared Constance was no longer merely a woman, and that fire alone could not touch her. The pilgrimage. The band rode south, following reports of a pilgrimage, hundreds of women in white veils traveling the back roads, carrying relics of the dead, buttons from uniforms, locks of hair, boots caked with battlefield mud. Wherever they camped, they sang. Wherever they sang, death followed. Outside Atlanta, Harrison's men finally caught sight of them. By lantern light, the column looked endless, women and even children, all humming that same dreadful hymn. In the center, borne high on poles like a holy relic, was a coffin. The lid was carved with symbols no man among them recognized, twisting, almost alive. "She is in there," Sheffield whispered, his voice trembling. "I can feel her." The soldiers moved to strike, but the moment their muskets were raised, the hymn swelled. The very earth seemed to vibrate. Horses reared, men clutched their heads, blood trickling from their ears. And then came the vision. Constance herself appeared, walking among them, her grey dress untouched by mud, her face luminous as the moon. She moved through her followers, touching each bowed head. Wherever her hand fell, the women convulsed, then straightened with eyes glowing like embers. She turned her gaze toward Sheffield. "Greater than, you cannot kill what you have already claimed," she said. "You are mine, Henry. Mine." The soldiers fired, but the bullets passed through her as though through smoke. The coffin lid cracked. From within rose a sound, like 1,000 voices sighing at once. The veiled women fell to their knees, chanting in unison, "Mercy, mercy, mercy. Dash dash dash." The burning. In desperation, Harrison ordered the fields torched. Flames leapt high, catching the wagons, the relics, the coffin itself. Screams filled the night, not of women burning, but of something deeper, something ancient, writhing in the fire. The women did not flee. They sang louder, their voices rising above the roar of flames. And in the smoke, Constance's form did not fade. It grew, towering above the fire, her face both beautiful and terrible. Harrison shouted for retreat, dragging Sheffield back once more. "Not yet," Sheffield cried. "If she rises fully, she will never be stopped." But Harrison only shook his head, his eyes wide with horror. "She has already risen. Dash dash dash." The church reborn. The next morning, when the fire had burned itself to ash, the field was empty. No bones, no bodies, no coffin. Only the faint imprint of circles burned into the ground, marks like those of a great wheel, or perhaps a sigil of some forgotten faith. Rumors spread faster than wildfire. Some said the women had walked unharmed through the flames, their veils untouched. Others swore they had ascended, lifted into the night sky by invisible hands. Whatever the truth, one thing was certain, the mercy cult had transformed. No longer secret, no longer scattered, they had become a church. Constance was their prophet, their saint, their deathless mother. And her hymn was spreading beyond the battlefield. Townspeople began singing it in churches, in schools, even in the streets. Ministers found their sermons drowned out by the chant of, "Mercy is eternal." What had begun as poison in teacups was now a faith carried on every wind. Dash dash dash. Sheffield's torment. Sheffield could not sleep. When he closed his eyes, he saw her, not as he remembered, but as she had become, radiant, ageless, her eyes burning with a light that was not of God. Everywhere he turned, he heard the hymn, sometimes hummed by a child, sometimes whispered by a dying soldier. He began to doubt himself. Perhaps she had been right. Perhaps mercy was not cruelty, but release. Perhaps the world would be better if her song carried everyone to sleep. But then he would remember the faces of men who died smiling, unaware they had been robbed of their lives. And rage would return. He swore to end her, even if it cost his soul. Dash dash dash. A dark revelation. Late that autumn, Harrison and Sheffield met with a scholar of ancient faiths in Richmond, a gray-haired man who had studied forgotten cults of the old world. When they described Constance and her church, the scholar went pale. "You are not fighting a woman," he said, his voice hushed. "You are fighting an egregore, a spirit born of blood and belief. Every death she presides over, every hymn sung in her name, feeds her. You cannot hang her again. You cannot shoot her. You cannot burn her. She is thought made flesh." Sheffield felt his stomach turn. "Then how do we stop her?" The scholar leaned close. "You do not. Unless you sever her from the battlefield itself. She is rooted in the war. When the war ends, so too may her power. But until then, every death strengthens her." Dash dash dash. The true terror. Sheffield left the meeting shaken to his core. If the scholar spoke true, then every battle, every skirmish, every life lost was not just fueling the war, it was feeding Constance, making her stronger. The war would not end her. The war was her altar. And as the guns thundered across the nation, the Church of the Fallen sang louder, their hymn rising over the smoke and fire, a sound more dreadful than cannon or musket. Constance Grimsley had become more than a ghost. She had become the war itself. Dash dash dash. Coffin to be continued in Part 9. Dash dash dash. Would you like Part 9 to lean into the historic climax of the Civil War, where Constance's cult manipulates the chaos of battles like Gettysburg and Atlanta, twisting them into unholy rituals. Part 9: The Harvest of Gettysburg. The summer of 1863 was meant to mark a turning point in the Civil War. Both armies, worn to the bone, dragged themselves into the fields of Pennsylvania. What happened at Gettysburg would decide more than a nation's fate. It would decide whether the world itself belonged to the living, or to the Church of the Fallen. The gathering storm. Colonel Harrison had marched his men north, desperate to keep ahead of Constance's growing church. Reports spoke of veiled women moving silently through farmhouses before the battle, whispering to widows and wounded soldiers. Families abandoned their fields, leaving behind only the sound of faint hymns in the wind. When the armies clashed, the earth shook with cannon fire, but above the smoke another sound crept, a low, steady chant that no bullet could silence. Harrison's men swore they saw white figures drifting along the ridgelines, their veils untouched by the dust of war. One soldier, trembling, spat out the words no one wanted to say aloud. "They ain't women anymore. They're angels. Death angels. Sheffield's burden." Lieutenant Sheffield could not escape Constance's voice. Each night before the battle, he dreamt of her. She stood in his tent, her gray dress falling like smoke, her eyes glowing like embers. "You are not my enemy, Henry," she would whisper. "You are my beloved. Fight if you must, but every death you see belongs to me. Every man who falls is a hymn in my choir." When Sheffield awoke, his heart pounded with both dread and longing. He could not admit to Harrison that her words had power over him. To speak them aloud would be to betray his own soul. The first day, the fields of Gettysburg ran red. Thousands of men fell in the opening clash, bodies piling in the July heat. Flies gathered before the living could carry their wounded away. As dusk fell, Harrison's scouts reported seeing veiled figures moving among the corpses, kneeling beside the dead and the dying. Some men swore they heard the fallen still singing even after their last breath had left them. Harrison rode into the carnage himself. What he saw turned his blood cold. The veiled Sisters of Mercy moved in lines, their hands raised. Wherever they passed, the dead seemed to stir, their lips moving in silent prayer. The hymn rose louder and louder, until the battlefield itself hummed with it. "They're harvesting them," Harrison muttered. "The dead are hers now." The coffin returns. On the second day of battle, the coffin appeared again. Harrison's men spotted it atop a hill, carried not by soldiers but by the sisters. The symbols carved upon its lid pulsed faintly, as though alive. From the coffin drifted a vapor, pale and writhing, winding itself around the corpses strewn across the fields. Each body it touched stiffened, its eyes opening for one last dreadful instant. Then the singing began again, hundreds of voices, though no living lips moved. Sheffield fell to his knees, clutching his ears. "It's her," she calls to them all. The third day, the charge. When Pickett's men charged across the fields, the earth shook under their boots. Cannon fire split the air, rifles cracked, and men screamed. But louder than all of it was the hymn. The sisters sang from the ridge, their veils fluttering though no wind blew. As the Confederates fell in droves, the women's song grew triumphant. Each death was not a defeat, it was an offering. Sheffield saw it then with his own eyes, a shadow rising from the coffin, towering over the battlefield. Constance, radiant and dreadful, her arms outstretched as though to embrace the dying men. "Mercy," she whispered, and whole ranks crumpled as if struck by invisible hands. Pickett's charge became not just a slaughter, but a sacrifice. The harvest. When the smoke cleared, more than 50,000 men lay dead or wounded. But to Harrison, the worst horror was what came after. The sisters moved through the night like pale moths, touching the dead, their song drifting over the town. The townsfolk of Gettysburg huddled in their basements, hearing the hymn seep through cracks in the floorboards. One farmer swore he saw the corpses rise, not to walk, but to kneel, their mouths open in soundless prayer. Others claimed the blood that soaked the ground pulsed like veins, spreading outward in patterns that matched the sigil carved on Constance's coffin. It was not merely death. It was a harvest. Sheffield's defiance. Sheffield could bear it no longer. As the sisters gathered around the coffin, he staggered forward, his musket shaking in his hands. "Constance," he cried, his voice breaking. "If you want me, take me, but leave them be." The hymn faltered, the veiled heads turned in unison. And then she was there, before him, her face ageless, her touch cold as winter rain. "You do not understand, Henry," she said gently. "They are not lost. They are free. I give them what no general, no president, no God has given them, release." Tears stung Sheffield's eyes. "This is not release. This is theft." Constance smiled, a smile that chilled him to his marrow. "Then you will die believing that lie." She kissed his brow, and for a moment he felt himself slipping, falling into the same piece as the dead. But something inside him, rage, love, despair, forced him to stagger back. He raised his musket and fired. The ball passed through her like smoke, but the coffin cracked. The hymn shrieked, twisting into something inhuman. The sisters screamed, clutching their veils. For a heartbeat, Constance's form wavered. And then she was gone. Aftermath. At dawn, the battlefield was silent. The sisters had vanished. The coffin lay in splinters, its sigils burned into the earth. Harrison's men counted their dead, but the numbers defied reason. Too many had fallen, too many gone without trace. Some corpses were simply missing, their places marked only by scorched grass in the shape of kneeling figures. "We won the battle," Harrison muttered, staring at the ruined field. "But she won the souls." Sheffield stood apart, his musket still smoking in his hands. He did not know if his shot had harmed her or only delayed her. All he knew was that she would return. For she was no longer bound to a coffin, or a cult, or a field. She was bound to the war itself. The whisper spreads. In the weeks after Gettysburg, strange reports spread across both North and South. Soldiers on picket duty claimed to hear women singing in the dark. Dying men smiled with bliss, whispering Constance's name as they passed. And everywhere, in every camp, the same words began to appear, scratched into tent posts, carved into tree trunks, scrawled across the faces of the dead. "Mercy is eternal." The Church of the Fallen had fed on Gettysburg, and it was stronger than ever. Coffin to be continued in Part 10 finale. Would you like me to make Part 10 the final, apocalyptic confrontation, where Constance's church and the war reach their dreadful climax, and Sheffield faces his last choice between mercy and damnation? Part 10 The Last Hymn. The war dragged on, but for those who had marched through Gettysburg, the battle was never truly over. Every field, every skirmish, carried the echo of Constance's hymn. Men died smiling, whispering her name. Towns buried their dead only to find graves disturbed, the earth restless. The Church of the Fallen was no longer an unseen rumor. It had become a shadow that stretched over the whole nation. And at its center was Constance, the veiled widow, ageless and merciful, who promised release through death. Harrison's mission. Colonel Harrison knew the Union could not fight only flesh and blood. The Confederates were enemies, yes, but Constance was something beyond war. He gathered what few officers believed his story, men who had seen the sisters on the battlefield, men who had watched the coffin split at Gettysburg. They formed a secret company, not listed in any army log, sworn not to fight the South but to strike at the church itself. At the heart of every report was the same place, a ruined plantation in Virginia, once called Willow's End. Locals whispered that Constance had made it her sanctuary, that beneath its collapsed chapel she kept the true relic of her power. "It ends there," Harrison told them. "Or it never ends at all." Sheffield's guilt. Lieutenant Sheffield followed, though his soul was frayed. He had seen her vanish at Gettysburg when his musket cracked her coffin, but he knew she still walked. She haunted his dreams, her lips brushing his ear, her whispers sweet and venomous. "You are mine, Henry," she would say. "Even now, you live only because I wish it." Sometimes he woke with blood on his hands, not knowing if it was his or another's. More than once, his comrades caught him humming her hymn under his breath. He begged them to bind his hands at night so he could not wander. Still, he marched with them. He had one final task: to face her and end her mercy. Willow's End. The plantation had burned years before, its walls black skeletons against the autumn sky. Yet the chapel stood, its roof broken, its bell fallen, its altar cracked. The air around it was thick, heavy as though every breath carried dust and ash. Inside, the sisters waited. Dozens of them, veiled and silent, their white dresses gray with soot. They stood in perfect stillness, blocking the altar where the ground itself seemed to pulse. And then she came. Constance stepped forward, no older than the night Harrison had first seen her in Maryland, her eyes glowing faintly beneath her veil. Her voice was low but carried through the ruin like thunder. "You come with rifles and fear," she said. "But I come with mercy. Lay down your arms, and I will give you rest. You need never march again. Never bleed again." The sisters raised their hands, and the hymn began, soft but swelling. The ground trembled. From the earth, pale hands clawed upward, soldiers long buried, summoned to kneel before their eternal widow. The confrontation. Harrison raised his pistol, his voice cracking. "You've stolen enough. This ends tonight." Constance only smiled. "You think you end me with powder and lead? You cannot kill what was never alive." The sisters advanced. Rifles fired, but the bullets passed through them like smoke. The soldiers screamed as cold hands dragged them down into the earth, where the hymn grew louder. Sheffield staggered forward, musket in hand. His voice was ragged. "Constance." The veil turned toward him. Even through the shadow he saw her smile. "My beloved," she said. "Come to me. Be the first of my eternal husbands. The church needs a father as well as a mother." Sheffield trembled. For a heartbeat, he wanted nothing more than to fall into her arms, to let the war and pain dissolve in her mercy. But then he saw the faces of the dead, men from both armies, their mouths frozen in silent hymns. He saw their stolen souls. And rage filled him. "No," he whispered, "not mercy, slavery. The last hymn." Sheffield dropped his musket and grabbed the fallen chapel bell, cracked but heavy. With a roar, he swung it against the altar stone. The bell shattered, but the sound it made was not of this world, it was a scream, metal and spirit breaking together. The ground split open, the hymn faltered, the sisters wailed, clutching their veils as black smoke poured from their mouths. Constance shrieked, her form flickering. For the first time, her voice lost its calm. "You dare betray me," she cried. "You could have been eternal." Sheffield staggered toward her, gripping a shard of the bell. "Better mortal and damned than eternal in yours." He plunged the shard into her chest. Her scream tore the chapel apart. The sisters crumbled into dust, the risen corpses collapsed into earth, and the hymn broke into silence. Constance's form dissolved into ash, her veil falling empty to the ground. Aftermath. The plantation fell quiet. No song, no shadow, no whisper remained. Harrison's men gathered what little was left of their company. "We won," one said, though his voice held no triumph. Harrison looked at the ruins, the empty veil fluttering in the night air. "Did we?" Sheffield stood apart, the shard still in his hand. His eyes were hollow, his skin pale. He said nothing. In the weeks that followed, the war ground on. Men still died, but fewer smiled as they fell. The whispers faded, yet Sheffield was never seen again. Some claimed he deserted, others that he was buried in a nameless grave. But soldiers told stories in the camps, that on nights when the wind carried faint music, they saw a lone figure walking among the tents, humming softly, a gray veil clutched in his hands. Epilogue. The Price of Mercy. The Civil War ended in 1865, but the scars of Constance's church never healed. Families whispered of daughters who vanished in the night, of hymns drifting across fields after a storm. And in the archives of forgotten letters, one scrap remained, written in Sheffield's hand before he vanished. Greater than, mercy is eternal. But so is defiance. If you hear her song, cover your ears. If you see her veil, run. Do not trust the kiss of the widow. For her church waits still. The veil was never found. And some believe the Church of the Fallen has never truly died. In the end. Folded hands. If you enjoyed this 10-part historic horror saga, don't forget to subscribe, share, and leave your comments. Your support keeps stories like this alive, and maybe, just maybe, keeps the veil at bay.